time for this week in microbiology. This is episode number 99, recorded on February 11th, 2015. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you are listening to TWIM, the podcast that explores unseen life on Earth. We have a special episode for you today. We're coming from Washington, D.C., where it's a bit chilly. It's 2 degrees Celsius, but the skies are absolutely crystal blue, not a cloud in the sky. And I'm at the American Society for Microbiology Biodefense and Emerging Infections Research Meeting. And we've decided, like last year we did a session on the science at this meeting. This year we're going to do something different. We've collected a few people who have had scientific training but have gone on to what we call alternate careers, that is, not doing bench work. And I've collected a few of them today. We're going to hear about how they got to that point, and maybe some of you might be interested in doing similar things as well. I also want to welcome the audience. We always get great audiences here at Biodefense, so thanks for coming. If you would, you could open all your soda cans at the same time. That would be cool. We already opened them. All right. So let's introduce my special guests today. On my right, and I have to tell you, these are the longest titles I have ever encountered, right, in my career. Usually academic titles are short. She is the director of the Division of International Health Security in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Maria Julia Marinissen.
Very good.
Welcome to TWIM.
A pleasure.
Thanks for coming. And to her right, he is a supervisory special agent in the Biological Countermeasures Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate here in Washington, D.C. Edward Yu, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And finally, to Edward's right, he is in the Division of Medical Countermeasure Strategy and Requirements, also the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, David Howell. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming and sharing your insight. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we have to stop because your titles were so long. I want to start with each of you telling us a little bit about your educational background. Start with where you were born and educated and so forth. Let's start with you, Maria.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. You can tell for my southern accent that from south in the world. I'm originally from Argentina. Finished there my PhD in biology, work on molecular biology and biochemistry. Came to NIH to do my postdoc at the oral pharyngeal cancer branch with Silvio Goodkin, and stayed there for 7 years until I became a senior research fellow after a series of positions at NIH. Okay. And then we go on as you tell us.
Yeah, we're going to figure out how you got from science to where you are now.
Excellent.
But that was after that period of doing bench research, you went into your present position.
It was very interesting. I was very interested in looking at opportunities to move to the policy world, but it was really a challenge. You know, every time I would apply for a position, people would tell me, well, why someone with such a strong scientific background or such a CV and a good number of publications want to move to do something different. Everyone thought it was very awkward and that perhaps there was something strange going on. So finally, I found out about the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The organization creates an opportunity for scientists and engineers to come to work for the government for a year as a fellow to do policy work and bring, fresh talent from outside of government. And that's the way I was able to get into, what is now the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response almost 9 years ago. So I started as a fellow, and then I competed for positions and stayed there and started to create a career path and some innovative areas of work within the public health emergency preparedness and response world. Specifically focusing on the international arena, which is something that we weren't prepared to do so in the past. And that's how I started to work in the government.
So you made a conscious decision to leave bench work. Is that something you wanted to do?
It was very hard. I remember my boss then telling me, why would you like to leave the lab? You're doing such a good work here, and you have great skills to continue in a scientific career. Plus, I love science. I mean, even after 9 years of doing this work, you ask me, what do you do? I'd say, I'm a scientist. And it was hard. What moved me, I think it was the need to use everything I learned, the scientific method, the importance of bringing science to, and apply science to, problems that were affecting the society, and use that and put it to work. I had the opportunity to be an attaché spouse for 3 years. My husband was a Marine attaché in Spain, and that helped me, figure out the need for bringing the international aspects of science and of public health together. So it was a tough decision. It was a very tough decision. I still have all my DNAs and my pipettes and my tips in the basement of my house. I actually built a special fridge to have all in there. Sometimes I still dream of loading gels and doing PCRs. But yet, I really wanted to use science to inform policy.
So you keep your pipettes and everything in the basement. Do you ever go down there at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep and pipette just to give you?
I look at them, a few times a year. I look at them, make sure they still have something inside. So.
Okay, the garage science is a big deal now.
I know.
You can actually do that.
That's why I keep them.
Edward, tell us about your background.
Sure. So I'm a native Californian. Been out here for about 6 years now, so I'm still kind of getting used to the weather. I got a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of California, Irvine. And then I did my graduate studies at the University of Southern California. So I did about 6 years of research in human gene therapy and retrovirology. Transitioned from that to the biotech sector, where I worked for 3 years, almost 4, at Amgen, a premier biotechnology firm. And during that time frame, September 11th, 2001 happened, of course. And I guess that sort of galvanized me. Always wanted to do something, I guess, to contribute to society, and I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed doing research so much. But 2001 really motivated me to do something more.
Right.
And while at Amgen, I went ahead and applied to the FBI as a special agent. Got accepted, spent 5 months at Quantico at the New Agent Academy, graduated, was able to go back to Los Angeles, and spent 4 years as a field agent. I conducted counterterrorism investigations, and then got promoted to my current position as a supervisory special agent, transitioned to Washington, D.C. at FBI headquarters, and where I've been running our biosecurity program for the last 6 years.
Do you have pipettes in your basement, too?
I am so jealous that she does, because they're
I can share. We can
they're
do
not that
basement
easy,
parties.
and if I ever get around to clearing out my garage, I'd probably establish my own garage laboratory as well. But we are familiar with that community, and we actually engage with that amateur community on a global basis, actually. And we can talk a little bit more about that
Yeah,
later.
we should. I guess it's somewhat of a concern. Some people have raised the concern that it's actually the garage scientists who are not the scientists themselves. So why did you pick the FBI? Did they have an ad in the paper?
Come on, it's the FBI. No, I think it was a good mix of looking at wanting to do more towards national security, and I guess it's every little kid's dream to become an FBI agent. And the fact that it was a challenge. I came straight from a laboratory setting, and to marshal the ability to meet the physical requirements, the physicality of the job, as well as all the other aspects. And then pleasantly being surprised to learn that, well, one, the FBI hired me because of my scientific background and training, and then being able to leverage my training and prior work experience in the lab, and successfully using that in my field work as an investigator and working cases. And it was putting the scientific method to good use.
Good. All right. Well, we'll explore it some more.
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
hear David, your training.
Thank you. So originally grew up in Long Island, New York. Was thankful to be spared the accent from Long Island, but that's where I grew up. And started out in the field of physics and did my bachelor's at Bucknell University in physics and focused a lot of time doing lab work there and studied specifically nonlinear dynamics, also known as chaos theory. For this, I was running experiments in fluid dynamics and crystal growth formation and so forth, a little bit of time in nuclear physics, and really decided I wanted to try something different. So when I went on to grad school, I started out in a physics PhD program, but made the jump over and actually changed majors while in graduate school and did a master's instead in international affairs. And really wanted to get into some of the policy implications and strategic analysis in looking at nuclear weapons specifically. After that, I went on to work at the RAND Corporation, which is a nonprofit public policy think tank, and did a lot of work there looking at counterterrorism. That was just, I started to work there just a few days before 9/11 happened, and so that opened a lot of areas of research that RAND was interested in looking at counterterrorism. And then I eventually came over from there, went into do a PhD at RAND. They have a graduate school within the think tank. The Pardee Rand Graduate School, and did a PhD in policy analysis there.
Mm-hmm. So from my view, it's even harder for a physics scientist to get a job than a microbiologist. Did that play any role into you switching to policy?
So I actually, when I was finishing up my undergraduate, I was looking at kind of two different career options. And those were one, to look at jobs in industry, and two, to look at going down the route to become a professor and pursuing the PhD. So I started going down that route and quickly decided that I was not satisfied with sort of the prospect of spending all that time in the lab in the future. I wanted to do something that had broader impact for that, but would still make use of my technical skills.
Right.
And so when I started looking around at things, and I actually really prepared myself to defend why I could succeed in international affairs as a physicist, and I was thinking these people are going to come in and look at me like I'm crazy and say, why on earth do you think you could do this? And I got the opposite reaction, and really found that they were eager to engage me and get my science background and be able to apply that to a lot of the policy and strategic issues that they were looking at. And when I went to the RAND Corporation, I found that I was among a lot of people who had that background of international affairs and physics. That was very common there.
All right. So let's explore what it is that you do on a daily basis. Maybe Maria, you could.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned when you went over my title, I have the honor of leading a team that works on international health security. Basically, our mother office, where David and I work, is the office in charge of coordinating all the preparedness and response to public health emergencies for the country. We are within the office of the secretary, the HHS secretary. So every time that there is a public health emergency, our boss is the one that sort of coordinates all the response to a public health emergency, to include the different components of HHS, CDC, FDA, NIH, and everyone that plays a role, and then interacts with other departments, including DOD, Department of State, when the emergency has international implications, and other agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, that, as you probably know, is the agency that leads the preparations of preparedness and response to all emergencies for the country. So
not just public health.
Not just public health, right. There's something called the National Response Framework that has support functions that determine who does what in the government every time that we have an emergency. Call it Katrina, call it, oil spill, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, you name it. So, within that National Response Framework, there is this emergency support function number 8, which is the one that explains how we're going to respond to public health emergencies.
So what would be some examples of public health emergencies?
For example, one that you are all familiar with was H1N1, Ebola, the responses that we did during Haiti, during Fukushima, the accident in Fukushima, and some of the local responses. You remember the oil spill that we have in the Gulf, Sandy, many of the big tornadoes, some of the chemical spills that we have had in rivers. Our office has a big office, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, where we're associated with, which is the office that does all the development and acquisition of what we call medical countermeasures, vaccines, drugs, diagnostics, to respond to chemical, biological, or radiological and nuclear events and pandemic influenza. So we basically develop or buy smallpox vaccine, anthrax vaccines, botulism, antitoxin, you name it, and put it in what we call the strategic national stockpile that is managed by CDC. Then we have another big office that is the Office of Emergency Management that runs the HHS Secretary's Operations Center, and that's the entity where the response is the command and control room, basically, with all the big fancy screens to have visibility on everything that is going on when we had to coordinate these responses. And among many things that they do, they lead the National Disaster Medical System. And these are teams of disaster medical assistant teams, disaster mortuary teams, veterinary assistant teams. So these are all deployable assets that we send to support the response in our states when the state and local capacities are overwhelmed.
So for example, if there were an outbreak of foot and mouth disease virus in the US, you would acquire vaccines?
That's foot and mouth disease is a little bit outside of the scope of what we do. We wouldn't take normally of public health emergencies that we can control. We will be more in charge of those types of emergencies that can really cause destabilization of a region or the government. But nonetheless, we do pay a lot of attention, and there are situations like now, measles, for example, and things that we follow and we make sure that we are coordinated to respond if this become a bigger event. And within everything that I'm telling you, I'm in the Office of Policy and Planning. There is the office that sort of bring together all those operational components and keep the machinery going. And in particular, my team is the one in charge of taking care of the international aspects of all these. Our office was created in 2006, right after I joined, and had purely a domestic focus. I mean, what do we do to protect the United States health security? If we have an emergency like anthrax or Katrina, for example, man-made or natural disaster or accidental releases of threats. But we started to obviously understand that we're in a globalized world, that diseases know no borders, and that we needed to prepare, and that we were as prepared as other countries were prepared. And a typical example is what happened during H1N1. The disease started in Mexico and spread immediately over the world. Ebola is another example. Fukushima, for example, in Japan was something more contained, but all of a sudden the fear of radioactive material coming to the United States or contaminating passengers or contaminated food created a lot of issues for us here in terms of policy and in terms of preparedness. Haiti, for example, something very localized, but where we had to deploy for the first time internationally the National Disaster Medical System. And all these HHS assets, all these assets for public health were specifically created for our country. So now we are taking that to another level and figuring out how we utilize those assets during international emergencies. Understanding that our health security is first, but we live in this interconnected
So there
world.
wasn't any particular incident that catalyzed the necessity to go international, or was it H1N1?
There were, we were working on international things even before I joined the office. There was after 9/11, I think it's something that changed the world. We started this biodefense era. The ministers of health of the G7, Mexico, the Director General of WHO and the European Commission were having dinner and realized that these like-minded countries didn't have any coordination mechanism if there was an event, a terrorism event that would affect all these countries. So they created the Global Health Security Initiative and started to work right after 9/11.
Okay.
So there were a series of international efforts. What we just did was to take it to another level and solidify all the efforts in a division and start to grow the people working on this, training people, and try to have a budget for it, which is important.
Right. Okay, I have more questions for you, but let's find out what you do, Edward.
Okay, so I have many facets to my program. But I guess for the most part, the most important thing is that in the US, we have something called the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Criminal Statutes. And it's put on the US government's books for our ability to fulfill our obligations to the Biological Weapons Convention, which is this international treaty to prevent the misuse of biology for offensive purposes. And that criminal statute, if the verbiage is the prevention of utilizing any biological agent, toxin, or delivery system for use as a weapon. And for clarification, that doesn't necessarily mean just the select agents, which are what among the projects that are being discussed here. So select agents are the Ebola, smallpox, and all those, and anthrax. But the criminal statute is any biological. So any microbes that even you all might be conducting research on, if we're trying to prevent the absolute misuse, and especially if it's for malintent. And that's a pretty hefty responsibility, considering the challenge that life science and research is inherently open. And so that means that we have several responsibilities. So first, on the investigative side, in support of those criminal statutes, many of you remember just within the last year or two, we had some very colorful characters attempting to mail ricin-laced letters to the president. Our division, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, facilitated and supported the investigations at the field level to apply those criminal statutes. And one of the key elements of our program are in each of our field offices across the US, there's at least one special agent that's trained in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear matters. They're called WMD coordinators. It's a pretty cool title. And they're charged to be the local ambassadors, the point of contact for state and local public health, law enforcement, and to proactively reach out and engage with universities, with companies, institutions, to establish that point of contact so that if there's anything that ever happens, that those entities know who they can contact and report. And our program, when it comes to biological matters, we backstop those agents in the field. So that in of itself is a pretty hefty responsibility. And that's just on the investigative side. So the WMD Directorate was also born out of the 9/11 events. It's the youngest division within the FBI. And it came about as a recommendation from the 9/11 Commission and then the WMD Commission to prevent the development, acquisition, and use of WMDs. So from a biological standpoint, it's a pretty tough thing to try and prevent misuse of biology because the materials they're naturally occurring in the environment. The absolute strength of biology is that it is open source and openly shared. So then how do you prevent the misuse? And that embarked us on a hefty program in outreach and education. So you'll find my program and its representatives reaching out to universities, providing biosecurity workshops. We even provide assistance to foreign governments as to what does it mean to protect biology and implement measures that protect the research, protect its applications, and most importantly, protect institutions like universities and the students and faculty members that work there.
And in fact, we had a few, I'm on the Institutional Biosafety Committee of my university, we had a few New York City agents visit us and talk about it.
I know them well, yes.
And that's where I got this idea that the garage biotech is what scares them the most. That's what they told us.
Well, and honestly, I think let me clarify that. So we engage those different communities ranging from your top flight global pharmaceutical companies to universities to even this amateur DIY biohacker community. And the concern for us is that, first off, we recognize that they're a completely benevolent, incredibly important source of potential innovation, but we want to prevent, again, its exploitation. That because, again, this area is so open that we worry that there might be some bad actors that might try to take advantage and leverage these really important endeavors, whether they happen in a garage or at a university or at a company, no matter what. How do we engage the community itself to best prepare them to be on the lookout for that type of activity? The community members themselves are not the problem. What they're doing is incredibly important for biology as in of itself. But the fact is that agencies like the FBI are educating them to be on the lookout for suspect activity, that there are these other elements that might abuse the important work that they're conducting.
How do you do that? How do you track what's going on in these garage communities?
And so and it's not just a matter of garage communities. I mean, if you look at how many research laboratories in general there are
Sure.
internationally, there's a lot.
So you go international?
Oh, we do. We definitely do. And so again, one of the things we do is engaging the local communities, and we even sponsor the cutting edge elements like there's something called the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. It's a global undergraduate synthetic biology competition where they spend the summer months reprogramming microbes and imparting novel functions rather from secreting biofuels to therapeutics.
Yeah.
But we engage all of them, and I guess to put it very simply is we impart three things, and we use this when we engage with high schoolers and college students who are engaging in these areas more and more these days. But the three tenets we leave them with is have fun. I mean, you have to be passionate about whatever it is that you do. It has to be worthwhile. You personally have to have a stake in the matter. Secondly is be guardians of science. So whatever it is that you're working on, it is our responsibility as citizens of science to ensure that we protect and prevent the misuse, abuse, or exploitation of biology. And then third, and probably most importantly, is to pass it on. Is that as you grow up in your careers and move on, that you become the future mentors. That not only you're promoting science, but you're protecting it in the future. And those three tenets apply across the board. And because we come about it that way, despite the fact that it is a counterculture type movement, even in the garage community, they fully embrace engaging with the FBI, which if you think about it, is really pretty incredible.
Yeah. I think the idea of telling them to be guardians of science is fabulous, because I don't think most scientists look at it that way. Be a guardian of your field.
That's
I mean,
true.
everyone thinks, yeah, we have to make results and make life better for everyone, but I like that very much. I think that's really good. But you must also track what's going on in research labs. That must be an enormous problem because there's so much going on.
Well, but that's the fundamental aspect of if we've done our job right and we've equipped the people, the members of the community to be, well, one, what to look out for, and then two, understanding what the role of an entity like the FBI is, we no longer have to be the ones that watch because we don't have the capability,
Sure.
the resources, nor the legal mandate to do that. But what we found as we've been doing this for a few years now is we've had insightful members of the scientific community that say, aha, I've identified this activity, or based on this attribution, this capability that I've now discovered, it might be exploited this way. And then the tables have turned. They now become the educators of the FBI and call it to our attention.
Right.
So that's honestly the best of both worlds.
Yeah. So as you know, dual-use research is a concern now. Do you get involved in that if someone is proposed an experiment, it's funded, and it could conceivably have dual use? Would you then be monitoring that?
Not specifically, but the best thing is the fact that, for example, you just mentioned that that you met with yours in the context of your institutional biosafety committee.
Right.
That's exactly what we're helping to have happen. Is our job is just to instill this element of security, because if you think about it, that criminal statute I just cited, that's the absolute spirit of dual use, in the fact that here is legitimate research that's happening all over the world for absolutely beneficial, legitimate purposes. But the fact is that there are elements out there that will try to subvert that for nefarious use. And it's not just being specific towards any kind of list or anything, but it really does focus on the intent. It really is all about intent. And to get the scientific community on board as to understand that's our approach and that's what we look at as far as dual use is concerned, it makes it a little bit easier even for anyone out in the audience to understand what dual use means. It really does mean being on the lookout for whatever you're working on. If there's some smacking of information or you observe activity that the work might be being exploited for illegitimate purposes, they're in the best position to flag it for themselves and then to be able to notify an entity like NIH, like the HHS, or the FBI when it's warranted.
Yeah. So, I mean, all this is to try and preempt things.
Correct.
But when
Right.
things do happen, you also react as well.
Yes, yes. But then it's always going to be in collaboration with our partners.
Right, right.
Okay. David, what do you do in your job?
So I work to coordinate federal efforts to ensure medical countermeasure preparedness for threats to national health security. And so namely, by threats to national health security, we mean chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear terrorism threats, and also emerging infectious diseases to include pandemic influenza. And so there are, as you might expect, there are a lot of different agencies that are involved in working on this. And so we coordinate this through a group that we call the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasures Enterprise, or FEMC. And we work to coordinate all the different strategy and policy issues that we need to address within that structure. And so this involves things in looking at early stage research and development. We also have advanced stage research and development, looking at what kinds of things we need to do to improve regulatory processes, what kinds of things we need to do in terms of procuring and stockpiling medical countermeasures for the country, and also looking at response planning for this, so recognizing we need to be able to actually use these in a large-scale public health emergency. And oftentimes the events that we're planning for are on a really massive scale that will far outstrip what we can do at a state and local level.
So there's some overlap between the two.
Yeah, we work together. We tend then take a little bit of what they do and try to work with international partners to solve some of the international issues around this.
And so maybe an example of the kind of policy work that we do in here would be every year ASPR with CDC co-lead an annual review of the Strategic National Stockpile, the SNS, which is managed by CDC. And the SNS is a central repository of medical countermeasures that we can use to respond to a large-scale public health emergency that would outstrip state and local capabilities for that. And so we have to go through and decide what are the types of medical countermeasures that we need to buy given a limited budget for that, thinking through long-term, what kind of medical countermeasures will be possible within the next several years for this that we need to be planning for. What are the ones that we need to that are going to be coming up for expiration, and how do we try to plan that out so that we can have a consistent ability within the SNS to support preparedness.
And you also have an international focus as well?
We're really focused on the U.S. civilian population. However, we do have ways that we coordinate then with Maria Julia and others to make sure that we can also use that to support international efforts. And so, in our recent Ebola outbreak, we've also had, many folks from the FEMC who have gone over and supported involvement there, as well as many of the medical countermeasures that were created. Ebola was a threat that we had considered as a potential terrorist threat. And so we had several countermeasures that were in development at that time that were then expedited for the response.
Right. If I can interrupt and give you a concrete example of how we work together. For example, H1N1, BARDA in our office is the one that acquires all the vaccine.
BARDA.
The H1N1 vaccine,
Okay.
right? BARDA usually makes acquisitions based on the requirements that David's office set. They are the one that say, this is what we're going to buy, this is what we're going to develop, or this is what we need. BARDA goes and buy it and put it in the SNS. And then we work to determine what we will donate to the international community. And then our division was in charge of, executing that international donation. So, we work together internally, obviously, in our office, and then with CDC, FDA, and others.
So let's say in the next year an Ebola vaccine is tested and approved. Would that be part of the stockpiling strategy?
So that would be something that we would then have to take into consideration with that and look at balancing that across all of the threats that we look at. So what we do in our requirement setting process is to go through and say, okay, how much of different types of products do we think that we would need, given information that we would get from the Department of Homeland Security and others to look at what is the threat area for this. And then to say, well, what would be the types of medical countermeasures and how many of those would we need to address that? And then to look more detailed and say, well, what would the specific characteristics of a product need to look like? We take all of that information and include that when we're going through a review for the SNS, and then saying, okay, given budgetary constraints and giving all these competing priorities, what is the optimum mix for medical countermeasures that we want for any given budget year for the SNS?
So you can't be prepared against everything. It's just not possible.
You can't do everything.
So is that something that you would be working on to decide threat levels of various, say, infectious agents?
So I don't myself work in that area, but we work with individuals from DHS closely and coordinate for those and looking at counterterrorism threats. And we are more recently now standing up processes to look at evaluating emerging infectious diseases that would occur naturally, and working in particular with DHS and CDC on that.
So you would handle, on the other hand, say if there were a nuclear reactor accident in the U.S., you would be involved in that.
Yes.
And you've probably developed countermeasures to deal with it already. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, David, what in your training as a physicist lets you do well in your current position?
So I think one, training in the sciences gives you a great ability in terms of just being able to apply a scientific method to policy problems. A lot of the problems that we look at here they are intractable problems. So even in that example of the SNS, or if we just more broadly try to say how prepared are we within any given threat area, these are intractable problems that you don't have an easy solution. You can't just put it out on a whiteboard and say, here's our answer to this. And just being able to go through and using that scientific background when necessary in terms of identifying what is actually going to potentially happen if one of these events occurs, and what would our response be able to do to lessen the impact of that. That relies more directly on the scientific background, but even more broadly, just the scientific method and being able to say, okay, what do we think would be the projected outcome in here, and then how do we take that and analytically weigh that against other potential threats. And all of these are, we're in an area of really intense uncertainty for this. So coming up with really strong analytic techniques to try to address that and look at what is the potential impact, the economic impact of these.
So, in fact, someone who worked with you wouldn't have to be a physicist. They could be any kind of scientist.
Yeah, and I should say that I work, I'm one of the few physicists around in my office, but I work with a lot of microbiologists, chemists, so it's a broad array of different, and other folks who come more from the policy sciences as well.
Edward, what about you? What about your training as a scientist helps you today?
Well, first on a personal level, it goes back to that I mentioned the citizen scientist.
Yeah.
Based on what we've been seeing, especially in the area of synthetic biology and these other emerging areas, firmly believe that the 21st century is going to be the century of the life sciences. I mean, we're seeing incredible applications and the convergence between the life sciences with the data and computer science realms, and we're going to see amazing applications. And having said that, though, it galvanizes me to make sure, how do we pre-position ourselves that with this incredible capability, that we leverage it only for the benefits and downplay or mitigate any of the risks ahead of time. So there's that one aspect. It's not on my watch, is biology going to get misused? And then secondly is when I was a newly minted agent right out of Quantico, I was thrown my first investigation as the new guy on the squad. And I actually leveraged, I mentioned before, the scientific method. It's basically, here's a situation where here's the possible criminal violation, like, okay, that's my hypothesis.
Exactly.
What data points do I need to support that, or the evidence? And then when it comes time, be prepared to take criticism. So much like facing a thesis committee and being grilled for 3.5 or 4 hours, that was a lot of fun. But to be able to answer every single one of those questions, so that in the same vein, if you have a potential criminal violation, how do you can argue supporting that violation to a federal magistrate, a judge, to get a search warrant or arrest warrant, or ultimately to stand under fire of a cross-examination of a defense attorney? So and honestly, a thesis committee is probably a lot harder. But that level of training led me to conduct investigations in a way that was able to successfully complete them. So my prior life in how you question and how you experiment and validate served me very well, even to this day.
So Maria, how about you? What in your training helps
I think
you?
everything, that I did as a scientist, I use it night and day. And let me tell you an anecdote. When I was interviewing for the Troopers Fellowship with HHS in the office where David is now, they selected me because they wanted me to be leading the development of requirements for medical countermeasures for radiological and nuclear threats. And I was working, before on cancer research and oncogenesis. And I said, well, why? And they saw in my CV training on radiochemistry. And there are very few people that have formal training on radiochemistry, like for a year, to understand alpha, beta, gamma. And that was critical in terms of develop the requirements, because you really needed to understand the science to then figure out and bring people together to the table to coordinate with everyone in the government what is it that we need in the stockpile to respond to a radiological or nuclear attack. Without understanding the science, you wouldn't be able to do it. Years later, in the job where I am now, Fukushima happened, and I get a call from my assistant secretary saying that we needed to brief the secretary in 2 hours on what was going on in Fukushima. She was traveling. And we needed to put together a briefing on Radiation 101 to explain her why radiation was a problem and why it would affect public health. And if it's not because of the scientific skills of going online, putting figures together, putting a PowerPoint together in less than an hour, that then has to be cleared by everyone before it goes to the secretary, to the point of going to the briefing with the secretary and explain the difference between irradiation or internal contamination to someone that is a lawyer. So that ability to communicate scientific issues in a simple way when you're in front of an audience have been key. Also, a lot of what we do is facilitate the decision making. We put a lot of options in front of our leadership so they can make decisions. And the rigorous scientific method is, I think, the secret of our success in what we do in our team. When you start, when we've been through publishing papers and going through peer review, I don't think it gets more difficult than that, kind of your thesis committee. I mean, it's very hard. You had to really show that you have the data to support your hypothesis, so the reviewers cannot tear down your paper. Sure. Well, here is the same in policy. You had to get all the data from all the different components, all the science behind, so they are sure that they are making good decisions based on science, on evidence. And then you put it in a paper in a very clear, succinct way so they can make an informed decision. So application of scientific method.
If anyone has a question, by the way, we have a mic and you can get on TWIM that way. You can get your video, so just step up there because I may not ask all the questions you're interested in. So let's say there are some people out there who are trained in science and are looking for something else. David, what can they do to make themselves competitive for doing what you do?
Sure. So one of the routes that I will frequently mention to people that I came to federal service on is the Presidential Management Fellowship, or PMF program. And so when I finished up my PhD at RAND, and I really loved the analytic rigor that I experienced at RAND and the types of topics that I got to work on, but I wanted to do something that was a little bit closer to the decision-making process for that. So I was looking at jobs in the federal service and was having a hard time trying to understand the whole federal system and how all these offices interacted, or what I could contribute to their missions for this. And I had discovered the Presidential Management Fellowship as an inroad to service in the federal government. And so that one, it allows some greater flexibility in terms of agencies being able to hire individuals for that. But in addition, it has a lot of other characteristics, one of which being that you do rotations and you work with a kind of a home office, but then you get to go out and work with other offices either within your department or in other departments. So I started out at the Department of Homeland Security, and I was focusing on radiological and biological threat detection. I went to State Department and was looking at radiological and nuclear smuggling issues. And then I came to ASPR and was looking at medical countermeasure preparedness. So I got a very diverse experience within different CBRN threats across different agencies and different portions of that mission space. And then I think I never would have imagined coming to HHS when I first started out working in counterterrorism. I would have thought that there wouldn't be much play for HHS in that area. But I had discovered through that PMF experience then that this was really a natural fit for me, and really enjoyed that area as kind of a natural intersection between policy and science.
Okay. Edward, is it reasonable to think about a career with the FBI if you're a scientist?
Oh, absolutely, and especially in a post 9/11 world, it actually was a difference maker for myself, but then also for the FBI. Most likely pre 9/11, the FBI probably would not have hired someone with my background. Back then, organized crime was the priority, but now in this world of counterterrorism where prevention is a priority, the FBI has diversified its hiring practices, and right now, if you have even foreign language skills or computer science skills, you're a hot item. And for those of you in the audience, this is a very esteemed panel, but I'm the Wallowitz of the group. I only have a master's degree. But so I can say that there is life without a PhD. But my word of advice is that it goes back to having fun. Be passionate about what you do, because that'll reflect in your work ethic and your work product, how you comport yourself to your managers and coworkers, and just put yourself out there. Apply, find out what you're interested in. And especially when it came to my application process, when those background investigators came and talked to my research director, I mean, it caught him off guard, of course. Like, what did Ed do? Why is the FBI here? But then at least I was able to put them in a position to be able to say, no, I mean, Ed was a hard worker. This is what he's able to accomplish.
Okay.
And you can only get to that point where you're that passionate about what you do, even if it's pipetting away ad nauseum. I mean, if it's something that you're really truly passionate about, and you get the work product, and be able to convey that. That's the other thing. You need to be able to sell yourself. We're often, I'm also an introvert, but you need to be able to showcase what you've accomplished and what you are really good at, and what your training has been. So that's my advice.
So at the general meeting of the ASM, the FBI often has a booth on the floor along with the other exhibitors.
Yes.
What are they trying to accomplish by doing that?
Well, as I said, we're looking at expanding our talent base. So it's not just trying to become a special agent like myself, but we have other positions like intelligence analysts, and also actual scientists that work in our laboratory division down in Quantico, so the individuals who actually help develop and utilize those tools for forensics and attribution purposes. So it really is, we're always looking for good talent.
So you don't have to go to Quantico and get beat up to work for the FBI?
Oh, why wouldn't you? No. That is for the special agent track.
Okay, so I did a TWIM a few months ago with a fellow from a company who was involved in developing the PCR that's used in post offices to detect spores in every piece of mail. So would someone like you or a scientist be involved in developing that?
Oh, no, that's our folks that are working in the laboratory division. This is another angle that I failed to mention as part of our program, is that we also look at, again, under the auspices of the Biological Weapons Convention and our technical capacities, our program looks at how do those things get characterized and implemented in policy. So I find myself here in DC heavily involved in some of the interagency policy making when it comes to biosecurity as well. Okay. So but much as you mentioned, you need to have some familiarity with the technical aspects of it to be able to convey to someone that you might be sitting across from your table in a policy making may have absolutely no science background. So it's really going to be incumbent upon individuals like yourselves, if you ever do decide to pursue a career in policy, to be that bridge between science and how it applies in policy and impacts society.
So Maria, how could people prepare for doing what you do?
I think what Ed was saying, be passionate about what you want to do is super important. Find what is it that you really want to do in the future. Dream big, don't be afraid, and then the opportunities start to show up. Like after 9/11, same thing happened. I started to be very interested in biodefense, but I was working on molecular biology, cancer research, and it's like, I'm never going to get there. How am I going to do it? It won't happen. I don't know anything about infectious diseases. But if you have a goal, then the opportunities are going to start opening up. So if you're interested in policy, for example, start reading the first part of Science, the Science magazine, what brings up weekly what are the major policy issues in science and in public health. Start reading about it. Start volunteering in committees, in societies, talking to groups that talk about these big policy issues that have such a need for scientific input. And then look out for fellowship opportunities. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter where you are in your career. I was relatively senior in my career. I was having my own laboratory when we moved to Spain and applied to the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which is it's a fellowship targeted for, senior people to shift gears. So don't be afraid of exploring. It doesn't matter where you are in your career. We have people doing the fellowship with us that were in their 70s and were senior professors in Georgetown, trying to look for that experience of learning policy to bring it back to the academia. So it doesn't mean that it's going to be a permanent move either. It's a bunch of things that you can learn and then bring back to your communities, to your university, to your institute. So read and contact people. Networking is essential. Start talking to people that are in those positions. You all know about the 6 degrees of freedom, so you are going to always find someone that introduces you to that person that you want to talk. Schedule a lot of informal meetings with folks in key positions that can tell you what they do, so you can really learn about whether that's what you'd like to pursue or not.
David, can you tell us one really exciting thing that you've done recently in your work?
So one thing that we're working on right now is a large project to look at how do we assess medical countermeasure preparedness overall. So how do we come up with a measure for preparedness, and for this particular vaccine, how prepared are we for it? So we've come up with different ways that we can measure different elements of that, and looking at how far are we in research and development and our manufacturing abilities for it, and our ability to access things in an emergency, and then our plans also to be able to use a medical countermeasure in the event of an emergency, and then also importantly, do we have the capacity to use it then if push comes to shove for that? And so this is a really complicated multi-year project that we're kind of rolling out with right now, but trying to come up with sort of global metrics for preparedness for this. And what I would stress is that it really did rely on coming back to a lot of the scientific training and trying to think, how do you develop that kind of measure? How can you actually go out and implement it? And so it was an exciting project because it hit on multiple elements here in terms of thinking about what is important for the policymaking process. But it also came back to what is useful analytically, and how does that marry up, and how do we take the scientific-based knowledge for that and apply that through this process.
Can you give us an example of a medical countermeasure that you'd be thinking about?
Sure. So we would do this for something like a botulism antitoxin. Okay. Would be something that we'd look at, and we'd say, so do we have a product that's approved for that yet, or where are we if we aren't? Can we make enough of it? Thinking about how much can we use for that, how are we with our planning and things like that.
Edward, how about you? What are you doing that's exciting?
Well, I'm living the dream. Actually, the two things that I think are really important to me is that when I go out and myself and my teammates go out and embark on this education, that although you may not work with select agents, there is this international treaty and these statutes that are on the books, and that you all have a role to play in protecting biology, and seeing the positive response has been absolutely phenomenal, not only within the US, but globally. The latest thing is that, as I mentioned, we looked at synthetic biology as an emerging area, but we just completed a project last year looking at, the next big thing, and you've had several episodes on this, is looking at large data sets, and especially this is where genomes, your microbiome, your transcriptome, all of that are going to be heavily leveraged in the future for making very specific health decisions for you personally in looking at precision medicine. One of the things we concluded in our project, and it was a joint AAAS United Nations project, is looking at what is security looking like in this even wider, more open space, that as people start putting out if you decide to get your genome sequenced, what protections are there going to be? Right? And so beyond just privacy, there are a lot of issues that potentially could have profound impact on society, on individuals that we haven't really been addressing yet. So for example, we just had that story recently about the significant hack of Anthem and the patient records that were taken. So for example, if I decided to take your bottle of water that you sipped from and I swabbed it and sent it in for sequencing, I now know very intimate parts about who you are. And what protections are there going to be in place if I happen to be somebody who wanted to exploit it or use it for extortion or something along those lines? Those type of security questions in an era where you're wearing wearable technology to monitor your caloric intake, your sleep patterns, your running activity, and that's being uploaded into the cloud. When your most intimate parts of who you are and how you live is getting put out there, from a law enforcement perspective, how do I address protecting who you are and in society in general? So that was a very profound question that we came up with at the end of this project.
Yeah, it's a very interesting problem, yeah. Maria, how about you? What's exciting?
Well, the response to the recent Ebola outbreak has been beyond exciting. I'm bringing together the aspects of the domestic preparedness with the international response, and the efforts of the government in Liberia have been a huge challenge and excitement. But to give you a concrete example, I mentioned that we're working on this international deployment of countermeasures. When we made this request to donate botulism antitoxin that David mentioned, it took us, from another country, it took us 9 months to respond. Based on all the processes that we've been putting together now from the time, typical government bureaucracy, but from the time that we get a request to the time that we're injecting the antitoxin in the arms of a patient is just 20 hours internationally. And based on all that expertise and the donation of H1N1 vaccine that also took us a year, we've been working with the WHO on a framework to deploy vaccines internationally in an emergency. We have been using smallpox vaccine as a case study, and we brought together the G7, the WHO, the European Commission, and we have put a framework in place of how we're going to coordinate internationally, who's going to request what to whom, what logistics we need in place, how we're going to work with the regulatory authorities so things that are approved in the United States can be accepted by other countries, et cetera, et cetera. We had an exercise last year in October where the senior officials, the vice ministers, played what these different countries will do, and right after we started with the possibility of having to deploy Ebola vaccine. So we were immediately able to use that work that we did for smallpox and apply it to Ebola vaccine and create an entire checklist of actions that WHO and all the countries around involved in this response needed to take to make sure that the Ebola vaccine could potentially be used for a mass vaccination campaign if depending on how things progress in Ebola. But very exciting to be able to help real time.
All right, I have one more question for all of you. David, is there anything else you'd rather be doing?
No, I think that for me, this has been the perfect job in terms of being able to bring in elements of the interesting analytics in terms of policy analysis for this, as well as relying back on the science. And so that was something that really appealed to me from early on, before I could even really quite articulate it yet, was that idea of the intersection between policy and science. And I think that this is a great area to be in for that, and it's an exciting time to be in this area. And so I couldn't imagine anywhere else I'd want to be right now.
Okay. Edward, I have a feeling I know the answer. Is there anything else you'd rather be doing?
No, this is, as I said, this is the time to be in the life sciences, and to be able to be in a position where I'm supporting national security and at the same time supporting the moving forward of science. And the fact that I get invited to be on TWIM. I oftentimes have to kind of take a step back and realize just how fortunate I am to be able to do what I've been doing. And then also really, again, as I mentioned, just the positive response, the receptivity that using this type of messaging, how it's been well received by all parties involved.
When I invited Edward to join us, he said he was a big fan of the show. And I thought at first, wow, it's surprising that the FBI knows. And I said, no, it's not surprising. They must know everything. Maria, is there something else you'd rather be doing?
I had to confess that I had a moment last year when I really thought about that, because I've been almost 9 years in this organization, and it's literally 24/7. You sleep with your BlackBerry. It's one emergency response after the other, and it's tough. So I really thought for a moment, how long can I do this for? Because it's just literally it's very hard to have some work-life balance, let me put it that way. So for a moment I thought that perhaps I wanted to do something related to everything I learned on the international arena and bring it back a little bit more to the scientific work. I mean, do the same type of work, but more related to science, basic science than to public health. But after thinking a lot and really trying to search inside, I came to the same conclusion. I can't have this much fun, or I can't imagine where I would have this much fun. So it's no.
So you don't
Happy
want,
to be where I am.
You don't want to go back to do bench science, right?
No, other than in my garage if the FBI let me.
Oh, no, absolutely.
I don't have a PCR machine though.
And
harmless.
I'm supremely jealous.
We get a lot of listeners who do the garage do-it-yourself stuff. They're always telling us about what they're doing. It's very interesting.
And that's the next biggest, it's that community that's going to come out with the next Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, that equivalent.
Yeah. Garage, right?
Yep.
That's where it started. All right, well, this episode of TWIM and all the others, you can find them at microbeworld.org/TWIM. You can also find them on iTunes. And of course, if you have a pod-catching app on your phone, you can subscribe as well. It's all free, and all the back episodes are there as well. And if you do have questions and comments, send them to twim@twiv.tv. I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. Maria Marinissen, thank you so much for joining us.
Really, my pleasure. This has been great.
And Edward Yu, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. This has been great.
And David Howell, thanks very much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
I also want to thank Chris Kandayan, our producer over there from the ASM, and Warren over on the camera, and of course ASM for their support of This Week in Microbiology. The music you hear on TWIM, by the way, when you go to listen to this on our website, is composed and performed by Ronald Jenkins. You can find his work at ronaldjenkins.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time on This Week in Microbiology.
Thank you so much.
Once you're in the BSL-4 space, the only way you can get out is to go through a chemical shock.
It's an unusual room. Never seen anything like this.
Anybody who has access to this facility first has to go through an IR scan.
So the HEPA filters filter the air coming out of the facility, and that will remove bacteria, viruses, anything that might constitute any kind of risk, right?
Remember, this building is basically a second building inside the main building.